Hi, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Business Blind Spots Exposed podcast. I'll call it Blind Spots just because the other one is really way too long. But uh, let me tell you about a personal journey for those who are joining for the first time and who have listened in before. For me, it's all about blind spots and finding my own blind spots. As I've grown as an individual, as I've grown as a leader, my ability to find my blind spots and how fast I can find those blind spots is what's on the other side of my success and a better outcome for me. The purpose of this podcast is to talk to industry leaders, experts, people who've been there and done that about the blind spots that they have seen. So maybe you can take away a couple of hints or take away a couple of actions for yourself so that today, tomorrow, or in the future, you can step through those doorways faster because you can identify the blind spots that are holding you back. Um, hey, Tracy, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Vinay?
Good. So, everyone, I've got a really exciting friend of mine, Traci Philips. We've become fast friends we became fast friends very early on and have continued to remain friends over time. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get into this. I want to tell you a little bit about what's coming up in the next coming weeks. I've got some other exciting guests that we've got scheduled to end with Tracy and telling you a little bit about her. So on October 25th, I've got Forum Brown. Uh, she is going to be talking about this topic of the hidden company talent and how to find them. Forum was a very successful engineer at a very, very large and well-known engineering company across the globe. Um, and as a woman, she had some challenges kind of pushing through some glass ceilings that were there. And she really took on this purpose and this mission to find that hidden talent so organizations and leaders could find where they're and use them for their full potential. On 10/13, October 13th, I have Jody Wolkerling. She's going to talk about the resilient organization. Why does it matter? Everyone seems to think, or at least I've always used to believe, that an organization is something that you kind of set it and forget it, right? It's you put the pot on the stove, you turn the flame on, and you come back 20 minutes later, and your food is done. Nah, it doesn't work like that. Things are constantly changing. Jody is going to talk about this idea of the resilient organization, one that changes, it adapts, and it morphs and transitions over time, and how to be aware of that it's coming. But that brings us to today, Traci Phillips, and the title that we decided on was Your Verbal Communication Says Everything About You. I'm going to share a quick story for everyone, and I think I'm going to stop talking here very shortly. But the first conversation I had with Tracy was supposed to be an hour long conversation. Tracy, I think it was 2 hours and 15 minutes later.
Yeah, you had to run off to go get the kids.
Yeah, and that was the point where I realized that language means everything. I and just as soon as it came out of my mouth, I said, Tracy, I have to go pick up my kids. And you looked at me just as I said that, and just as soon as it left rolled off my tongue, I said, have to. Why did I use that word have to? I want to go pick up my kids. My kids are one of probably the greatest creation I'll ever make and contribution I'll make to this earth or this universe, whatever the context is. And Tracy said, why did you say have? Have to? And I realized being intentional about the words that you use is so powerful in terms of how others receive it and what they hear from you. So I want to give a quick background about Tracy, and then Tracy, maybe we start with that story if that's okay with you. Uh,
Absolutely.
so Tracy, an executive leadership and performance coach to visionary entrepreneurs and corporate executives. She has an innate gift of decoding language to discover one's purpose and blocks to help clients develop more effective thinking, communication, resolution strategies, and decision making, and leading during times of challenge when the stakes are really high. It seems like there's more and more of that these days. She's passionate about showing leaders how to create a more cohesive, cooperative experience and environment within their workplace cultures. And the ultimate goal that she has is to support her clients to authentically lead and find their own blocks and build their own awareness so they can use that awareness to figure out who they are, what their purpose is, and where they're leading themselves and the charge of the company, and ultimately the legacy that they leave behind. I've always found it a pleasure talking to Tracy. Tracy, I'm so excited to have you on today. How are you today? You're doing well. It sounds like today has started out a little bit of a rocky path for you.
Yeah, we lost internet today. Well, I mean, I'm here obviously, so we have one computer in the household that's directly tied to a router, so we have connection, which is great. But it's good. I mean, that's all about communication, right? When we don't have those lines of communication open, we recognize how much that affects our ability to get things done the way we want to, effectively, efficiently, and really authentically, because that's the most important thing. And I love spending time with you. You and I could talk. I mean, I don't think we'd ever run out of things to talk about. It's more like a timing thing, right? But yeah, I mean, I know that first conversation when you were running off to get the kids, it's one of my favorite kind of entrances, because it's most of the time when we're talking, we're not really consciously aware or intentional about the words that we're choosing. Obviously, if we're in a situation where that's being called for, we are more so, but in general, words just kind of come. And that can both be, those could be trouble spots, but they're also amazing places to start to dig for what's really authentic. One of my favorite stories about communication, of all time, was actually when I was getting ready. So my previous career was as a teacher, and when I was getting ready to go into my graduate program, I had to get certain credits out of the way. And so one of the things that I was doing is I was volunteering at a school. This was in Denver, Colorado, for the developmentally disabled. So I happened to be in a pre-first hearing impaired classroom. And so I got this great opportunity to learn sign language. I mean, very basic sign. These were young children. But I remember being in the classroom. I was like a teacher's aide of sorts one morning, and I was watching this little group of kids, and they were sitting in this circle all facing each other. There must have been, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 kids. And, I, at that point, about 8 weeks into it, I thought I was getting my signs. I thought I knew some basic signs, and I'm watching these kids, and they're just signing furiously. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, I don't understand a thing they're saying. I'm not getting a single sign. I must be, I must be deteriorating in my knowledge. And the teacher came up to me and she was asking, I guess I had a look on my face. She's like, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, I was just thinking to myself, I'm watching these kids and I don't understand anything they're saying." And I'm thinking, I thought I had picked up at least a couple things. And she started to chuckle and she said, "Oh, well, they're babbling." And it was like this big light bulb went off. It didn't occur to me, like verbal children will babble, right? That's how we start to find our language. That's how we play with words. We play with sounds. We play with this thing called vocal cords. And in our communications also, we're playing with, how things land and all of that. And so what babbling does is it allows children, right, or people who are just learning to speak for the first time, the ability to play around with these things, with sounds, with ideas, with our communication. And if you're not able to do it because you're hearing impaired with your vocal cords, you do the same thing with your hands. And it had never occurred to me that it was a developmental thing, right? But it is completely. And so, with me, I think that was kind of the beginning and emergence of awareness of how much I spend time paying attention to those things. And fast forward to today, it wasn't until I was in coaching that I really found my blind spot, which was this innate gift in being able to read people's story and their language. In other words, their belief systems, their patterns of thought, even experiential things that they've gone through in life through their communications. And, whether that be in the tonality of their voice, the words that they actually choose, or even the patterns in their language, I started to recognize that I really was drawing out a lot of information unbeknownst to me. I just always thought I was a great read of people. And I am, but partially it's because I can read language. And so I always tell people language doesn't lie, and when we're talking, even when we say things like in a joking way where people will say something in response, you're like, "I'm just kidding." Know that person wasn't kidding. Maybe they didn't mean to hurt your feelings or come out quite so boldly, but they weren't kidding. right? We really need to know that, language will tell what's in our souls in so many words. And so where there's blind spots, we can use language to start to decode, and uncover some of those blind spots.
So, just as you're saying, I mean, as many times as you and I have talked, every time I seem to get another nuance or another layer of depth to what I understand of the world. I'm just thinking in this context of leaders, and actually, I want to take a quick moment here. I went to actually an event, a wedding this past weekend, a family wedding, and I actually was really surprised to hear that I had a number of family members and people that I'm connected to. Like, I really love your podcast. I get so much out of it. And the only reason I say that is, first of all, I was very flattered to hear that, and that's kind of them to say that. But more is, I think what makes these podcasts and these conversations so powerful is when people chime in and ask questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're on the right-hand side, actually, depending on the platform you're on, whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube, there is a comment box. Ask questions. Get Traci to give you some insights into what you're thinking and how you speak. We've had some fabulous interactive conversations with people. So if you want to just start out by just telling us who you are and where you're connecting from, I would love to hear that. But just use the comment box for that throughout the course of this whole conversation. It will really shape the value of this. But as I was thinking through what you were just saying there, Traci, one of the things that occurred to me is, that statement. Someone says, "Yeah, but I'm just kidding," afterwards. Consider that in the context of a leader. A leader says to someone, "Gosh, if you do that again, I'll probably have to fire." I'm just joking. Right? Now, there's a lot wrapped up in there. First of all, just let's talk about that leader themselves. In terms of them, there's a little fear of that leader of being harsh. That's clearly why they're saying, I mean, to me, that's what comes across in that, right? They're worried about being harsh, but then they're also sensing a lot of frustration. And there is a small little outlet of that frustration coming out saying, if you do that again, I'm going to fire you. I'm just kidding, because that makes all things okay. But the language doesn't lie there. And I'd love for you to kind of tell me if you agree with this, you see it a different way. But on the employee side, or the person you're talking to, the one who's being supervised, when they hear that, say, hold on a second, they don't hear the I'm just joking part. They say, you just threw a spear at me.
Mm-hmm.
Really? Now the guards start to go up, and everything that manager says from that point forward, whether they thought they're just joking, they just pass it off. It's no big deal. 5 weeks later, they're forgotten. That employee, it may have, depending on the type of person, it could be very deeply ingrained in the way they receive everything that you say from that point forward as a leader. Am I on the right track there? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, we all know, and you know very well, that one of the top traits that people, are really looking for in leadership these days is empathy. Another one, and this is an upcoming trend, I would call it a trend, because I think we always unpack things further and they go on to the next developmental stage. So during that developmental time, it's a trend. But is this idea of safety, right? And people feeling safe in their work environments, right? And although we understand that safety isn't something promised in general in the world, we came out of the womb and nobody promised us that we'd be safe. That's not part of what life is about. There is a certain degree as leaders of responsibility in ensuring that we are creating environments, or at least adding to environments, that where people feel safe to be who they are. They feel safe to make mistakes, to I'm going to say speak their truth, but to be able to show up as who they are, because really that's where our greatest value is, in who we are, not just the skill sets we bring with us, our learned and earned skills, right? But all of those things, our zone of impact is really both who we are innately in a value way, as well as the skill sets that we've acquired that allow us to do our job. And so we have to first feel safe. Nobody's gonna unpack their wares and start going to work if they don't feel that the environment in which they're about to work is safe. And so what we don't oftentimes realize when we're just kind of throwing things out there, whether it be through frustration or just, knee-jerk reaction over things, is that you're absolutely right. Each one of those things can erode that sense of security or safety. And from a very reptilian standpoint, it doesn't matter what age we are. If we don't feel safe and secure, we're not going to want to show up at our best. And if we're not showing up at our best, it's going to affect our performance, right? And so it becomes that vicious cycle. That leader who says, if you do that again, I'll fire you. Oh, just kidding. Is creating, if whatever that caused that initial mess up that leader is addressing in that commentary, it is going to feed into that cycle, because now the person feels, like you said, potentially, even if it's not on the surface, back in the back of their brain, they're holding on, to that little erosion, right? They recognize that, if I step there on the mountain, it's not secure, so I'm going to be a little bit more hesitant, to go over that side slope. So, part of it is recognizing that in order to make things safe, I do believe that people need to take responsibility for their ability to perform at their best, right? So it's not your boss's job to make everything perfect for you, to have the perfect environment to work in. Part of that is your responsibility as well. But that being said, each of us plays a role in our communicative approaches, in allowing a certain degree of safety in an engagement where people actually want to engage, right? Where they want to engage and they feel comfortable enough coming in, again, bringing out all of their tools and wares and doing their job as effectively as possible. If we first feel that the landscape isn't safe, we're not going to try to do anything until we determine that landscape is safe for us to move forward.
So here's a couple of things I heard out of all that. Right. Number one is this idea of empathy that has been there for some time. I think there's a lot of chatter and a lot of talk about that. But then there's this idea of safety. I think you and I both have a mutual friend who does a lot of consulting and a lot of safety training for companies and organizations. But a lot of that is physical safety. And I think what I heard out of this was this idea of verbal safety. Right.
Yeah,
Now,
emotional safety.
Emotional safety, right? And I think verbal safety is a kind of a leg of that. It's a smaller piece of that emotional safety. And I think what I'm hearing here is, well, the sort of the connection that happened in my head was this whole great resignation that people are talking. 15 million Americans, and I know the number has gone up since then, but 15 million Americans have left. And I've always thought that they were disengaged in the first place. Right? Those 15 million people didn't just say, "Oh, COVID, bye," right? It's been festering for some time. And the reason they've been disengaged is because their management has been disengaged with them. They weren't engaging them. My children will go and play by themselves for as long as they want if their dad never bothers to say, "Hey, it's time to come in and eat." It may not sound like the thing that they want to do, but I'm engaging with them. I show that I care in doing that. And I believe that this great resignation or this great disengagement, I think is probably a more appropriate term for it. The great disengagement is all about people just not having this emotional safety to speak where they are, because management says, "Hey, the meetings will continue until morale improves." He said, "Look, you're not listening to me. You don't really care what I have to say. So why the flipping kite should I listen to what you have to say?"
Right.
And they've just kind of gone down these different paths. Does that resonate with you as well?
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons that people are stating that they're leaving their jobs. There's a variety of reasons. I think, what the COVID, quarantine experience allowed all of us to do is kind of go into, our homes and reassess, right? To step back from our busy day to day and really, think about, is this what I want to be doing? So in some cases, people might have been working in environments that were just fine, but in that step back perspective shift period of time, people realize, I think I want to start that business that I had been thinking about for so long. It's not, no better time than now. So I think that the majority of people are citing that the reason they're leaving is they're not feeling valued for whatever reason, that they're not feeling that fulfillment or that value exchange, right? Where they feel that what they have to bring to the table is being valued, it is valuable, and that they can really, again, be fulfilled in that value in their work. That's very important. Value is something I've talked about for pretty much my entire coaching career. If we don't, first of all, know our value, it's very hard to know where that value is going to be valuable and valued. And I think people are starting to wake up to that. They're starting to wake up to what their value is and that they do have it. and that they're experiencing a disengagement, to using your word, between, or a gap between what that value that they're arriving at and understanding and what others are actually seeing or engaging with them in. And so a lot of it, and what I think is interesting, is people are leaving without a whole lot of forethought too. I was just talking to a client the other day, and she was looking to hire someone, and the woman who had reached out originally said, well, I'm just really doing this part-time because I'd like to get exposure and then go out on my own. I'd like to have more flexibility in my schedule. And what the conversation eventually led to, she says, my client said to her, who's been in business for about 5 years now, she says, I don't know if you realize this, but what you're saying, the value you want to get out of your position and your job, doesn't align with going into business for yourself. She says, if you think, you're going to have all this free time and you could do, what you're looking to do part-time, you might find a different reality, right? And I think a lot of people, it sounds good if they've been working for somebody their entire life, this concept of entrepreneurship and being able to have your own schedule and make your own, choose your own clients, all that sounds wonderful. But the reality is very different. And a lot of people find that, which is why many businesses close before they get to the year 5. So I think there's a lot of things that will, down the pike, it's going to affect, how leadership runs, but I think also how those who are being led, right, employee engagement. Because I think what happens a lot of times, we get fed up and we react, which is what we're seeing now. A lot of people are just reacting. Not everybody. Some people have thought this through, and it's been something they've wanted for a long time. But in general, I think the reason why so many people are leaving, but nobody can find anyone, is because people are waiting. They're sitting back saying, okay, now what? Now what? Because the people who are busy right now are the career coaches, the people who are trying to help with those transitions. Because people they just know what they don't like. They know what isn't working, but they haven't really defined for themselves what they would want instead. And so this idea of I just want to be valued isn't good enough, right? We have to figure out more decisively and define for ourselves more than just, well, I didn't like how I was being treated, or I didn't feel like my value was, valued. Well, what does that mean to you? And what are you doing, right, to ensure that your value is valuable and valued, right? Because it isn't just up to the other person to make it okay for you.
The topic of our podcast is your verbal communication says everything about you. And you can't have not efficient, but effective communication unless you know what your North Star is. Unless you know, and what I mean by that North Star, I think there's lots of different, that analogy can represent multiple different scenarios. If you don't know why you've left a job, if you don't know why you're still in the job, if you don't know why you're frustrated in that job, if you don't know why someone said something in that role that kind of just made you kind of turn your head sideways, is that the way you see it as well? If you don't understand how you're thinking and feeling about something, the words are going to come out or not going to be. And I learned this word back in 7th and 8th grade in geometry and algebra, congruence. Mm-hmm. But gosh, you brought this word back up into my towards the top of my lexicon and what I use on a regular basis, right? Alignment and congruence, right? What you're going to say to the outside world cannot be in alignment or in congruence with what you want if you don't know what you want. And I think this is kind of what you're touching on and what the whole great disengagement is about. Is that,
Absolutely.
Did I get that right?
You did get that right. And I feel like and I'm glad we're talking about it, because that's what isn't being addressed right now. And it's true of many topics, as we just kind of talk about the superficial symptoms, right? And we think we're talking about the cause. But in reality, if we have this, there's a reason for it, right? It's not that a bunch of people just, are feeling entitled and got fed up and decided to all march out of their jobs. To your point, it's been festering. But I think what it's also showing us is a need for better communication, because a lot of times when I ask a client, when they're frustrated with an employee, because I work with mostly, leaders. So it's usually somebody who's working for them that they're frustrated with. What is that frustration? In your words, what happened or what has been going on that has led to your frustration. But let's look at your piece in this. You're asking, what are your expectations of them? Have you communicated those? Have you communicated those effectively? Have you asked if your communication to those points has been effective? In other words, have you asked the person if they're clear on your expectations of what you want for them? Right? So there's a lot of places that we are not effectively communicating or thoroughly communicating that then over time is going to, erode that, that road, right? So now it doesn't feel stable, it doesn't feel secure. But if we catch it more on the front end, where we realize, okay, if there's an issue, instead of just letting it go, which happens a lot of times in the beginning, okay, I realize Joe is new, he's going to make some bumps, or he's going to hit some bumps, he's not going to do everything right, he'll figure it out. Well, instead of just doing that, addressing it, right? Addressing it, telling Joe, I recognize you're new. We expect people to make mistakes in the beginning. How can I assist you? Am I being clear enough? I mean, this is one thing you're really good at, Vinay, I think, is asking, all those questions from every angle to ensure that the person with whom you are communicating is on the same page as you are, right? We all have our different perspectives. And if you can gauge as much as possible what theirs is, you can meet them where they are much better. And so as leaders, I think that's something that we also want to be aware of at all times. It doesn't just get to the great resignation because it happened yesterday. These are things that have been going on for quite some time and are probably patterns in our own leadership and communication, that if we can start to get on top of that and have an awareness, and instead of just letting things go and letting things ride until they get to the point where they can't, that we're addressing it in effective, again, a empathetic, an open, a vulnerable, all those buzzwords now that we're using in leadership, that I'm saying that they're not just buzzwords because it's superficial, they are important, but where are we actually actioning them? We're talking about them, but where and how are we actioning them? And communication is a place where, that action is probably most important.
Gosh, lots of, I think you know enough about me, 10,000 thoughts swirling through my head right now. I will tell you, and I got, a couple of things that I want to make sure I hit. Number one is I think we got a couple people who chimed in, and I very much appreciate you doing that. I want you to tell me a story about some of these things, because I'm still a kid at heart, and I love my story. So I'm going to get you to tell me a story about a situation. But to that point of sort of the employees, one of the people that work for me, one of the first things I tell them is, look, I'm going to just take this off the table. I make more mistakes than anyone. I make one more mistake than anybody else in the world. So I'm the biggest failure on that measuring stick, but I will not give up. I will continue to get better. Right? And that's it, right? So you can't be worse than me, right? So that's being said, I'm going to give you the first project, and I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to try to do it, and you won't get it right because you don't know what questions to ask, right? Start asking questions. And I had a recent employee who tried to do that. After a week, she spent a lot of time building this, what was a pitch deck. That's not a role in sales, but I wanted to create a pitch deck for me just so she'd get an overall understanding. She came back frustrated by the end of the first week saying, gosh, this is not right. It's not perfect. And I said, yeah. And we talked about that, right? That's okay, right? Because what I appreciate is the fact that you get to the point where you started saying, I'm frustrated. I need to ask a question, because now all of a sudden I start to understand where she's coming from, right? And where her level of understanding and her level of maturity is. And I found that as a very effective next conversation. That conversation moved us miles forward as opposed to waiting 6 months for it to occur. So I agree that that level of candor in the relationship, instead of mixing words, saying, yeah, you really sucked at that. And next time you do that, I'm going to fire. I'm just kidding, right? That really is just not an effective way to do things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you did something there that speaks to that setting the stage of expectation. You set an expectation of what is realistic when somebody is coming into something brand new. And although we all know that, right? We all have that experience of knowing that we don't know what we don't know. We're probably going to not do as great a job in. But when somebody, especially our boss, makes that okay, right? I think one of the greatest compliments I've ever been told as a coach is, I've been told by a couple clients is that, I think what you allow me to do is you give me permission to be who I am. And although we don't need permission to be who we are, when we get that, it sets the stage, right, of support, of again, security. We feel secure in that environment or in that engagement because we recognize the person is giving us permission to just be however we need to be, right? They're not going to judge us if we fall short. They're not going to, fire us because we're not great out of the gate. And I think that as much as we think that that's something that goes hand in hand with the knowledge that somebody new is going to make mistakes, not until we say it do we actually give the permission for that person to feel it.
Yeah.
And so you did something really, really good on that front end. And that's why it was safe for the person to kind of say, hey, I need your support. Because you already set that expectation of, I don't expect you to succeed out of the gate. And so when she wasn't, she was okay admitting that she wasn't, right? Because she had been given the permission to do that. As much as we don't need permission to do a lot of things, we've been very, very conditioned to feel like we do.
Yeah. Elena, thanks for chiming in and commenting. As Elena says, love it, Vinay and Traci. Sometimes that knowing initially feels insignificant because we expect it to be too big. And then James chimes in with a hey, right back at you, James. Thanks for chiming out. Love more of your comments. What do you think of what Elena said, Traci?
Yeah, so I think that it's one of my favorite things is something Brene Brown shared at some point. I remember if it was a podcast or her TED Talk or whatever, but she had said she was having a conversation with her husband at one point, and he said, I assume everybody's doing their best. And she says, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, I don't, but it makes me feel better to think so. And I think that in general, we are always striving to do our best. I mean, again, when we aren't, it's because we have these perceptions of non-safety or non-equality or, there's usually a reason in our own perception for why we're not. But if we're left to our own devices and we don't have those hindrances, I think we are all showing up trying to do our best. And so, that bigger piece of, oh my gosh, there's all this, and I want to do my best, can be an overwhelming thing. And for anybody who's coming into a new position, and we're talking about new employees, but this also applies to employees who've been in a position for a while. I mean, after a while, if you don't feel seen, heard, understood, and valued, it is going to start to erode at those places within you, right? You're not being given the permission by being told. And it doesn't mean that your boss has to tell you all the time that you're a great employee. It's other ways that are subtle, right? It's how we communicate with one another. And I always tell people, gone are the days of hierarchical leading. We really need to look at leadership as partnership with our people, no matter what level the people are at, right? We could be the CEO of a company and we could be engaging with a janitor, right, in our building. It doesn't matter what level people are when it comes to their roles. As human beings, we are equal. And this is a big DEI thing, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are equal as human beings. And if we can see that as such and we can communicate that through our engagements, then that right there is going to set the stage for that permission, which allows people to show up, again, more fully and feeling more valuable. Right. I'll never forget one of my jobs that I had. So when I moved down here to North Carolina with my husband, I had a brand new baby, and I was a stay-at-home mom for a while. And when I started to get back into when I actually started coaching, my coaching program, I had a part-time gig as a personal assistant for one of the restaurateurs in our area. And I remember watching him in the restaurant every morning. I'd come in the morning and I had, my pad of paper to jot down all of the things that he wanted me to do that day. And I would get there a little bit early and have a cup of coffee, and I would watch him, and he would walk through the restaurant and he would address every single person by their name, ask how their husband or wife was, how their kids were. And he knew everybody in the building. It didn't matter what level they were at and where the relationship, direct or indirect, was with him. He knew who they were, he knew where their value was in his company, and he knew what they valued. And he spoke to that every single day. And I think that, I know him as a human being. He didn't do that just to ensure that his people thought he was a nice guy, right? He did that because he truly understood that for him to be the CEO of his company, it took all the people under him, right? To run all the different aspects of that company that he needed to have run.
Yeah.
And so, when our leaders look at what they're doing in that way, right? You say it all the time. We all say it. This game is a people game, right? And when we are working with people, we are in relationship with them. And when we think about it in terms of relationship, we usually address it differently, right? This isn't just my employee. I am in a relationship with this person. How do I want that relationship to go, right? I always say that if we had a marriage, right, or any kind of romantic partnership, and we treated that person the way we're treating some of our employees, that relationship wouldn't last very long, right? We ignored them unless we had to talk to them for some reason because we had to tell them something that they needed to do. And if that's how we handled our partnerships in marriages, like, they wouldn't work. And some people do handle their partnerships and marriages that way, right? That's why they don't work. So it really is important that we start to, again, communicate from a different perspective, even in our own minds, when it comes to the people we're engaging with.
So I want to bring this back, back to the title again, right? Because I want to ask people to see this, that there's what we're saying is, the title is your verbal communication says everything about you, right? That's kind of sort of the surface issue. And people might start to see that maybe I need to change some of my language, but it's not about the language, right? This is the surface and what comes out of your mouth, that comes out of the vocal cords, right? It's much deeper. It's down here, right? It's about where you're coming from, right? The place where you're standing, the 2 feet that you actually represent, that makes the difference in how the language comes out. People talk about this idea of intent. I think intent is, here's your language, here's where you're coming from, and intent is somewhere here in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. What the source of that intent is actually more important, right? If you truly, I do this, right, with my employees. I have an employee I just brought on. She just happened to finish reading a book. She's in Kenya. She happened to read a book about the history of the Civil War in Nigeria. I was like, that's really interesting. One of my other employees just went about 6 weeks ago she lives in Nigeria, to the Civil War Museum. And the one from Kenya said, wow, that's pretty incredible. I said, the two of you need to talk. Both of them sent me smiley faces. Not that I'm trying to do it. I just bought another 6 weeks of They Love Me from making that connection about Nigeria's Civil War, which has nothing to do with me at the end of the day, right? Mm-hmm. But it's the two of them will now re-engage because I just made that connect, right? And all it took me was about 19 seconds of time for that to happen. And those words right there conveyed so much to them in terms of feeling and how they will sleep tonight as a result of how I made that feel. Does that resonate with you?
It does. And, and I think we all operate from our zone of brilliance, and one of yours is connecting. You're a natural connector, right? You, from a visionary standpoint, you see where things connect at all levels. And so you see where people in time and space connect, right? And if they're not already connected, you can easily just pop those together. So for you to operate in our zone of genius always gives us the greatest degree of fulfillment. Yeah. So for you, it was a zone of genius fulfillment piece, right? We can only be who we are, and that based on who we are, we do certain things, right? So the being that you are is a connector, and so based on that beingness as a connector, you connect, right? So for that, you are looking to be fulfilled, right? That's the significance with our self piece. When we're aligned and congruent with who we came to be, we feel happy, we feel fulfilled, we feel, right, satiated in life. So that was your piece in it. And the beautiful thing is for them, being connected is what we came here to be as human beings. And so to communicate that, again, intention, I agree 100%, right? And when we look at that intention, what is our intention? Is our intention just to have lots of people working for us? Right? Because if that's our intention, we will lead that way. If our intention is to make connections between people and build cultures and companies that do better for the world, right? We're somehow bettering our market or our industry, right? It's not just a differentiator betterment where we're doing something different than our competition. It's literally that we're trying to leave things better than we found them. That's the legacy, right? If that's our intention, our leadership is going to follow suit. Right? So it's always about sitting down. Again, we talked before, what is your reasoning for things? You know, what is your why? You know, why are you engaging in this? What is it that you want to bring to the table? 3 things that I always ask people is, you know, when we talk about communication, what do you want to say? How do you want to say it? And why are you saying it? Right? Because if we can't answer each of those things, we probably aren't ready to engage in communication. Right? And that's all well and good when we have to communicate on the fly, it changes things. But when we get very, very good at understanding what our core intentions are, right? For you, it's to be who you are as a connector, among other things, right? Then we can realize that we're always going to be looking to be that in all of our engagements, right? And beyond that, our what, our how, and our why might change. But in general, it all should be attached to that ultimate intention that we have, right? It's to show up as in our greatest genius, so to speak.
So what I heard from that, distilling it into language that I can understand, right, is leaning into your zone of genius allows greater and deeper language to emerge naturally, right? So
That's right.
if you want to talk better to your employees, what is it that you like? What is it that you're all about? If you can kind of come from that place, because I've always felt that if the saying I have that I use all the time is I can pay people for their minds, but if I get their hearts, I win. I have gotten people to do things that they didn't want to, I didn't get them to do it. They opted in, right? They
Yes.
volunteered to do it because they wanted to do it for me, right? Because I got their heart, not
Mm-hmm.
just their mind. And if you can come from a place of, hey, I want to build this company, I want to build this, I want to serve this customer, I want to do whatever else it is, and where you're coming from and how you say it, the language will flow naturally. Where they say, they may even step up and say, I can take control of it and take care of that for you. And the lady that I have as brought on as my chief operating officer, one Cindy, she came on one day and said, Vinay, you don't need to be doing that anymore. I'll handle that for you. And wait, what do you mean? You'll just, she's like, you don't need to come to the meetings anymore. It's mine.
That's right.
Fabulous. To me, that was hard work. She wanted to take it off my plate. And the words that came out were from a place of, I know I'm not very good at this, but I've been doing it. She said, no, I'll take care of it for you. It just comes out naturally. Of course, it's taken some practice. That's what I'm hearing. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And I think what you're also providing is a great look at this new form of leadership that we really need to understand and establish, which is, again, the partnership leadership, right? It's the, we can still be the head CEO, right, in the corner office, right? It doesn't necessarily mean we're in the day-to-day trenches, to your point. We really want to be doing what we're best at. But it is really about understanding that what we want is for everyone else to have that too. Right. So it's the leaders who felt that they had to have their finger on everything to control everybody, to ensure that they do what they needed to do. That control model is dying. We cannot continue to have that and not have the great resignation, right? The great resignation is a response to that control leadership, right? That type of model that we've been sold for so long. And so where you're showing up as a human being and allowing yourself to be seen by your people, you're also allowing them to be seen by you. Right? They feel comfortable and confident that you're going to be able to see them and honor them and allow them to step into their zone of genius. That's what Cindy basically said. She knew she was better at that than you. And she had the ability to step forward and say that, not only taking off your plate something that was keeping you out of your lane, but allowing her to step into her lane of genius because you allowed that. Right? As a leader, you made room for that type of buy-in where people can say, oh, I belong there. That's my puzzle piece place. Can I try it out? Right? Leaders that always want to control will never allow for that, will never see that, right? And in the communication of it, it starts with that setting that tone of we're all here to work together in partnership. That's the model I like to bring in because I think it's easier for people to understand. when they've been so accustomed to the hierarchical way of doing things.
Elena and James, I appreciate you sending in comments. I'd love to hear if, what Tracy's saying, how that resonates with you, and what you've been. What I mean, we still have some time that we're going to be talking here, but I would love kind of what are the takeaway nuggets that you've gotten from this? Anybody else who's listening to it live or in the future? I'd love for you to put that in the chat. Tell me what you heard out of this, because clearly what I'm hearing is not going to be what you're hearing. We're hearing different things. But Traci, I want you to tell me a story. Tell me a story of how this verbal language. I mean, we started out with me, the have to pick up my kids versus the want to pick up my kids. That resonates so much for me and has powered so much of the way I think and how I've shifted the way I think. Tell me another story, a little fable of, or no, I shouldn't say fable, right? A lesson learned, right, from somebody else and how they shifted their thinking and how the verbal shift made a difference.
Yeah, I find with myself, for so long, growing up, language has always been important. I've always been a high level communicator. And many times it got me in trouble because even when I wasn't supposed to be communicating, I found ways to do it. But I learned early on too that the way in which we communicate, as they always say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, was absolutely true. Because at times when I was, communicating just based on what I felt I needed to get across, it wasn't oftentimes heard in the way that I really wanted it to be heard. And so this idea of refining, my approach communicatively speaking, has been something I've always been fascinated with. And I think my favorite story, because I like to, oftentimes, I feel like telling my own stories are probably easiest because I know them better than anyone, and I like other people to tell their stories. But I was asked to do, and this is actually this is in my book that just came out, looking at this particular story because it was such an impactful one, but that it also shows the importance of intentionality and how when we do become intentional about the things you and I were just talking about, that what, how, why. What I was doing at the time when I was asked to present, so this was a big group of a conference of women. That I was doing a presentation on self-care and just ways to kind of, keep yourself front and center in life. And during the presentation, well, I guess I should back up a little bit. Prior to that, about 6 months, I had been doing this intentional study because I tend to guinea pig myself with new ideas, right? So I'm like, oh, this would be really great. Let me practice it in my own life and test it, right? Test the data points on it. And so what I've been doing for 6 months is getting really, really intentional about my what, right? My how. And in this case, it was the where. At the time, I was focusing on the where, right? Where do I want to, guys, what's my intention? Where do I want to take this communication? Where do I want to lead this engagement to? Where do I want this to go? Kind of thing. That's the way I was framing it. And I came up with 5 words for each of those headings. So 5 words I wanted to focus on my what. What is the value that I'm engaging with, right? What am I bringing to offer? And I worked on my innate value traits. And so I had those 5 words. And before, and then for how did I want to, approach things? So this was what I had. This is how I wanted to offer it. And then where I want to lead things. For me, it's always transformational. I want to make engagements transformational if at all possible. Thought-provoking, things like that, right? These are some of the words that were part of my repertoire. And every single day, anytime I engaged in something, as I woke up, before I even interfaced with my husband or my daughter, I would think about my what, how, and where words. This is what I have to offer them, right? From my innate value. This is how I want to come across. And this is where I want to take things. And I did this in client, I sat and contemplated before client sessions, before anything, right? Before going to the grocery store. So for 6 months, I'd been, to say the least, uber intentional. And so before I went into this presentation, I sat in my car, I closed my eyes, and I'm like, okay, what are the words that I had designed around this presentation? What is it I was hired to talk about? What do I feel the value of that? 5 simple words. How do I want to deliver this? I want to be, thought provoking. I want to be kind. I mean, what are those words? And then where? What is the outcome I'm shooting for? And so when I got into the presentation, about halfway through it, I've never had this happen, but it went south. A woman, it was actually some research that I was presenting, and she took offense to it, stood up and literally just started blasting me. I mean, personally, attacking me, telling the woman who was running it, take her off. I mean, it was a shock. But what was interesting, none of us expect that to happen. And when it does, we don't always know what we're going to do. And I had never been in that situation, but here I am in a room of 200 people, and this woman's yelling at me. What do I do? What I found that I did was I immediately went into those words. And internally, I was doing a checklist. I was like, okay, my what words were this? Did I deliver those things? Yeah, to this point, I feel like I have. My how words, have I been doing it in this way? Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, that's what I've been doing. And where am I taking this? Well, I felt like I was taking it in a good direction. So I'm good. And at that moment internally, when I checked all my boxes and realized I was good, it then grounded me to be able to address what was happening, right? So just like we don't want an EMT coming to our rescue or a firefighter coming to our rescue if they're in crisis themselves, we want them to be grounded and ready and focused to help us. That's what we want for ourselves when we engage with other people. We always want to be as grounded as possible. And by having those intentional words and recognizing that what was mine to give, I was doing. This wasn't about me. This was about her. Now, how can I turn my attention out to her and support whatever I need to support out here? And what was interesting in being able to do that was there was a softness to my voice. There was a groundedness to my energy. There was an ability to be very, very direct and honest, right? One of the things I started by saying, thank you for being honest and sharing, right? And then it was, I never intended, to offend anyone. In fact, let me be very intentional about explaining to you exactly what I intended, right? So I had the opportunity to tell them about how intentional I was on the front end. And then I was able to say to her, if a simple communication causes this reaction, maybe that's something you want to look at. And there's no way I would have had the ability to be that direct in that situation under those circumstances if I wasn't grounded. And the only thing I can tell you that grounded me was my intentionality. And so that's one of the things that, again, I went into more detail in the book, but that is probably one of my favorite stories when it comes to intentionality, when it comes to our process of communication. Because when we think about what's core to us, what's most important, what's integrity for us, right? What is intention? What is our intention, right? Because all those things speak to intention. Then when these hiccups come up, right? That was a pretty big one, but we all get into these situations in life that throw us off. When we can be solid in our intentional space, it just helps us deal with that situation so much better. And it makes us better leaders, whether we're leading ourselves, our family, or a corporation.
And the way it shifts that conversation that we started with, if you do that again, I'm going to have to fire you. Just kidding. It shifts that conversation, right?
It does completely.
Now all of a sudden, the way you respond to that saying, hey, John, so let me tell you, as far as the company is concerned and this role is concerned, what happened last week is not something that is valuable. It's not reasonable. It's not something that we can have happen again. It happened. All right. So we have an opportunity together. Right? Let's talk through how we prevent that from happening. Are you interested? Right? Now all of a sudden it's the same conversation, but you're saying, look, I'm taking that off the table. That's not something that's going to happen again. It's happened. Fine. It's water over the bridge, water under the bridge, whatever that saying is, right? It's done. Let's get to a better place now. Let's go there together. And you can only get there. And those words say the same thing, but get you to a completely different place because you're grounded. That's the word that you use there.
Mm-hmm. You're grounded and your intention is to work together.
Yeah.
Right? If you're not trying to control somebody towards an outcome and you're instead looking at them in partnership, right? And asking for their engagement within that partnership, right? And your question is great. Are you willing to have that conversation with me? Right? Because I mean, most bosses will be like, well, I'm having that conversation because that person I need to tell them what they need to know. So again, remembering that relationships, people are about relationships, right? And so when we think about it in terms of, I'm in a relationship with this person, doesn't matter what that, again, CEO, janitor, doesn't matter what the relationship is, we're still in relationship. How are we going to handle those relationships, right? What do we want to leave behind? How do we want to engage with that person? Because again, it isn't about that person, it's about us. We engage based on what's within us. Yeah. And when we're not sure of who that is, we are always reacting to how other people are being, right? So we want to always come forward with who we are and acting from a place of who we have chosen to be, not in response to how someone else is being, right? So if somebody else, the other thing that I love, because it's the I got to, or I have to, I get to model, right? I have to go pick up my kids, I get to go pick up my kids, right? There's also this way of looking at life where we recognize that we are the driver of this vehicle, right? That's called our life. And we get to take ultimate responsibility for what we create in that, right? So it's really that empowerment dynamic, where as the creator, what is it that I want to add to the table? How do I want to take responsibility for this? And one of the things that when we say, you hurt me or you frustrated me, when you did this, that frustrated me. Well, no, it didn't. You chose to be frustrated. It happened and you chose to be frustrated, right? Let's get clear on that. Nobody can make you feel a certain way. You choose to feel. Now, they may have triggered you, right? They were a trigger. That's true. But you chose your meaning when it came to that trigger. So you get to take responsibility. So when we communicate, we also need to communicate as such, right? When you said that, the story I was telling myself was this, right? And as opposed to when you said that, it really made me angry, right? When you didn't speak up or you didn't pull your weight, I felt abandoned, right? The story I was telling myself when you didn't do this was that you abandoned me.
Yeah.
Right? So making sure that in our communications, we are taking responsibility for our peace is also incredibly important.
Elena had put in a couple of comments, and as we get to the end of the hour here, I want to get you to tell me how people can get in touch with you, but I want to read a couple of Elena's comments here. Traci, at one point you said, effectively communicate, thoroughly communicate. I love the frame of thoroughly communicate. It speaks to what we communicate from and not just the efficacy of communicating.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I agree with that as well.
Yeah, 100 thumbs up on that one. And Vinay, I love how you said the new employee, you're going to get it wrong because you're not going to know what questions to ask. In this case, her frustration led to her question. Stellar story. Questions help you and others to know where you're coming from. I mean, Traci, you and I have talked about this idea of inviting people to a better future. Who doesn't want an invite, right?
That's right.
If you can keep inviting
nobody wants to be, we're not here to, critically kind of feel like we have to cajole people into something, right? Or if we see it's important, we're not here to talk them into it. We're here to invite them, like you said. Yeah. And if we really think it's great, well, then we should be able to use communication that shows how great it is, right? So that other people will hopefully see it and want to be invited into that space. But again, ultimately, it's about people's choice. And so where are we setting things up so that people know, and again, permission, know that they have a choice in the matter, right? Big part of it, you've pointed out many times, Vinay, is in the questions you ask. Literally asking, is that okay? Right? I would love to give you some feedback. Is that okay? Even as the boss, right? Yeah, you have a right to tell them what you need to tell them, but asking them, I'm hired as a coach to give feedback. I'm always asking, may I give feedback? Right? I'm hearing something. Would you like to hear what I have to say? Would you like to hear what I'm hearing? Even though I'm being hired to do that, I still ask permission. That always gives people that space to be invited to say yes or no, so that engagement is really a partnership.
So I want to close our session or our conversation together, but I want to close with letting people know if they want to start to up-level their game as a leader, if they want to communicate more intentionally, know where that source for the intention is, how do they get in touch with you? What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, people can reach out to me. The best way is, I mean, if they really want to directly get in touch with me, they can email me at Traci, Traci, at theinnatecoach.com. Also my website, you can contact me through my website. The website's great because you can see everything that I'm up to. You can kind of, read my blogs, see how I think and what I do, but also all my offerings are there. And then also all of the different places, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. That's where I tend to show up.
And your book, you just tell people about your book. I will tell anyone who's listening in, I like to believe I was one of the first people to subscribe and opt into getting a copy of your book. I hope I was in one of the first one. I'd like to believe. I like to believe that I was.
Yes, you were.
But
that intention is true.
Tell people about your book. What is it called, and what should they expect in the book?
Yeah, so my book that just came out this last month is called Looking In. It's a leadership book, and it really goes into the importance of looking in to find the answers that we seek, that we've been very conditioned to look outside of ourselves into the world to determine, where our value is and if it will be valued, but really that these things get to be determined internally. And because we've been conditioned in a different way, it is kind of a little bit challenging to know how to start that. So the book is really designed to not only talk about these concepts, but to give instructional kind of how-to step by step on some things we can dig into to define these things for ourselves so that we can start to create that alignment and eventually that ownership, right, of where we're valuable, how we're valuable, where we're valuable, and knowing then why we want to engage with certain things because they're in alignment and congruent with that value point. So yeah, it's one of my favorite. I always tell people I subscribe to some of my favorite books are less than 200 pages. And they're either in parable form, because like you, I love story, or they're just kind of that direct, like I'm thinking things like the Four Agreements. They're very basic and they focus on basic things that we can practice and put into action. And both those things are incredibly important to me. So I think we understand through story, but then we also need things that are actionable. And so that's what I'm hoping this book is for people. But it is really to get leaders to understand that it starts within them. And those answers that they're looking to coaches or gurus or experts or whatever for, they're not going to find out there. They're going to only find by accessing what's inside of them.
And for anybody who, I'll put my own spin on what I think of the book and based on what I know of Traci. What do I think are the greatest athletes, the greatest performers that we've ever seen? They're not the biggest. They're not the strong. They're not always the biggest. They're not the strongest. They're not the fastest. They're always the most disciplined. What they are is the person who's standing it with the right perspective, right? They've got the right beliefs. And once you start to commit to those beliefs, whether you're Tiger Woods, you're Michael Jordan worked harder than anybody else, but he knew how to play the game his way. And that's what made him great, because his game was a game nobody else had ever played before. Tiger Woods was a game that nobody else had ever played before. And he kept doing it again and again and again. And there's plenty of men and women. If you want to start to up-level your way of leading and leading yourself, and much less organizations and other people, you got to have the right perspective. That's yours. And I think that's what you'll get out of this book.
That's great. Can you put that in written form? Because I want to put that in.
I got it recorded now. Thank you, Traci. I appreciate your time. Elena and James, appreciate you chiming in and give us some nuggets of wisdom that you got from this. But thank you so much, Traci.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for those of you who are listening, Elena. It's good to see you there.
Yeah. See ya.